Alright, let's go ahead and make our visual novel save file and take a look at the conversations that we should be able to save to file now. So let's go into our VN system and make a new file for our save files. Let's make a script called VN game save. This is going to be the script that will allow us to save all of our information to file. So when we save our game, we're going to be saving this class to a literal file on our machine. For us to do that, I'm going to go ahead and remove mono behavior here, and I'm going to make sure that this class is set as system.serializable. That way it can be written to file. We'll remove start and update because we don't need those anymore, and let's go ahead and fill out some of the variables that we're going to need to write to file. So to make it easy on ourselves to access the game file, we know that we're only going to have one that's active at any given time. It'll be the one that has either been created as we've started a new game, or it'll be whichever one that we've decided to load. So being that we can only have one active at any time, we can pretty much make an instance for the active file that's loaded into the game. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to make a public static VN game save called active file and set that to null right now because initially there's no file loaded. But we'll have our active file saved so that way whenever we want to save the game, we can just reference the active file and call the save function on it, and it'll go ahead and save everything it needs to file. Speaking of the file, what kind of file type are we going to have for this? If we make it a plain old txt, then anyone can just double click it and open it. So we'll just give it a custom one and make it our own special file type. I'll define this in a public constant string called file type. I should probably capitalize that. So file type, and this is going to be .vns for visual novel save. You can use whatever you want. This is just the extension that will be at the end of the file. So instead of .txt or .cfg, it'll be whatever you want here. And for our preview screenshots, what kind of file format do we want those in? Public constant string screenshot file type. And I'm going to save mine as a JPEG. It's going to use less memory and less space than a PNG file, so it's pretty much perfect for what we want here. And then, are we going to encrypt these files or not? Encryption is something that we'll enable, so I'll have a public constant bool encrypt files, and this will be set to false right now. Now, I'm also going to define a default path that these files are going to be saved to. We don't have anything like that saved in our file paths script because all we have is a reference to the resources folder where we load stuff from. But let's go ahead and add a new path here. So public string, and I'll just make this file path, which is going to be equal to a particular string where we'll save our game files. So I am going to go ahead and reference file paths, but I need to open that up and add a new path in here because all we have are our resources paths. I want to be able to get runtime paths. So the thing about when we export our Unity project is the file structure is going to be archived. Well, not archived. It's going to be basically condensed and packaged into the application. So everything that it needs is going to be either in the data files within the export directory or inside of the application itself. And we're not going to have access to places like assets or even resources anymore. Resources will be compiled so we can still load stuff from it, but we can't save anything to it. So we need runtime directories where we can save our files to, and we'll just define that as wherever the application happens to be saved at. So if we are running this in the editor, I would like to save that inside of the assets folder. That way it's easy to access. But if we have exported the application, then we'll just save it to the default location for all the persistent data. That might be app data, it might be the folder of the application. But we want a different path for whether we're in the editor or whether we have exported. That way, as long as we're in the editor, it's just easier to access what we need. So I'm going to make a public string called runtime path, and this is going to be a getter. So inside of this getter, I'm just going to do a quick check. If Unity editor if we're using the Unity editor, then we're going to return a particular path. Else, if we are not, then we'll go ahead and return a different path. And then we'll go ahead and do end if. So I'm gonna just move that inside of my getter because I hate seeing things out of line like that. So if we're in the Unity editor, then I'm going to get our default saving location as assets, and then maybe something like app data, where I'll save all my runtime information. So inside of the app data folder, if we're in the editor, that's where we'll save this stuff. And if we're in the Unity editor, or not in the Unity editor, and I'm just going to go ahead and type it in this section, that way I can get autocomplete done, and then we'll paste it in here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to return a different path, and that's going to be the application.persistent data, the persistent data path, plus whatever subdirectory I want, which would be app data. But that is only if we are not in the editor. Oh, come on now. You don't have to do that. Don't backtrack on me there. All right, there we are. So there we go. We can get our two different paths here, which means let's now go ahead and define a runtime path. So runtime paths, I'll make a public static read-only string, and this will be the game saves. So this is where our game saves are located. And that's going to basically be the runtime path. Did I not make this static? I don't think I did. It needs to be public static string. And we will reference runtime path as well as save files. So inside of the save files directory, that's where my VNS files are going to go. Which means for our file path, I can say filepaths.gamesaves, and that will take me into the gamesave directory. Now, as for what I want to name this file, every visual novel file is basically going to be tied to a particular slot on the save and load menu, which means we'll also be saving the public integer, I don't know why it just did that, public integer slot number, and I'll just have that as 1 by default. But the slot number is basically going to be the name of the file. So I will do the slot number, and then for the extension, it will be the file type. So basically this would be assets app data game saves 1.vns or 2.vns. You get the picture. That's where that's going to be saved at. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing for my screenshot path. The file game saves, same slot number, but instead I'll be using the screenshot file type. So we've easily got the path for both our file and the preview screenshot. Now, we've got our slot number, and that's going to be saved to file. And here's where we can save our player name. So, public string player name. We can now save our player name to this file. Now, whether we save player name by command or by variables or whatever, that's up to you. But we now have a place where we can save it. So we'll look at that later on. But let's go ahead and also create what the other things that we need to save. We know that we need to save everything for our conversations. Now, I did say that there are two ways we can save conversations. We can save a conversation primarily, and the best way is just by referencing the file name and the start and end index for the conversation, so we can rip the data from the file. But if there's a situation where we did not pass in that information, and maybe it's a special conversation, it will not have a file name, it will not have file end or start indexes, so there would be no way to rip it from another file to reload it. So in those instances, we need to save everything in the conversation, all the lines, and the progress of it. Those should be pretty rare, and I don't anticipate that being something we have to do for a visual novel, but just in case there's a situation, because you will be blending your games, probably. Some people will be blending their visual novels with like RPGs or what have you. So there may be instances where that will happen, and it could throw you for a loop if all of a sudden you're not loading particular conversations and you're like, why? So there will be two different ways we can save that. That means we're going to have two different classes that we can potentially save, and that means we don't know the type of conversation that we're saving until we go to parse it. So the best thing we can do, just like we did for our characters in the history states, is we'll just save the active conversation data in JSON format and then figure out what it was afterwards. So for each one of these conversations, let's make it a string array and call it active conversations. We also want the current state or screen configuration. So public history state, which is already serializable, that's going to be our active state. And our log will be a public history state array for the history log. So we can save all of our logs. So real quick, let's define those two different types that we can save the conversations into. Inside of our VN system folder, I'm going to create another subfolder called data containers. And inside of here, we're going to make two scripts. The first one is going to be VN conversation data compressed. This is the information that is compressed for our conversations that basically just allows us to save the file name and what sort of progress we're at and the start and end index. That way we can rip the data back out of the original file. So we're compressing it down to the least size possible, the smallest size possible. And the next thing is, if we don't have a file reference, we have to save the entire conversation. So VN conversation data. For organization, I've gone ahead and assigned all my visual novel scripts so far to the visual novel namespace. That's the VN manager, the VN game save, and the new VN conversation data compressed and conversation data. So for these two data containers, make sure that you make them system.serializable so they can be written, and also remove the mono behavior and the start and update functions because we don't need those. So what we need for the compressed information is only a public string for the file name, and then a public integer for the start index for where this starts in the file, and the end index for where it ends in the file, as well as one more integer for the progress for where we are in this conversation currently. That's it. Now we can go ahead and actually copy these three here, and we're going to go to conversation data and just paste those values in. But then instead of just the file name, we're going to take a public list of strings for the conversation and set that equal to a new list, which actually we don't need the start and index there, just the conversation and the progress for the full data. So for our game save, let's go ahead and make a save and load function. That way we can go ahead and write this file to disk and reload it whenever we want it. So this is going to be called directly from the file itself. So we'll make a public void called save, and we'll also make a public void called load. And what this is going to require is a save and load function to be created on our file manager. So let's go ahead and make sure that we have a way to save the file once we have all the data that we need. Well, actually, first of all, let's go ahead and compile the data that we have so far, and then let's go ahead and write the system to write it to disk. So we know that our active state is going to equal history state.capture, so we get whatever is on screen right now. And our history logs, history log, that should actually be plural, so history logs. So our history logs is going to come from our history manager dot instance, and there's something in here. Yeah, history. Okay, so that's all the history states. So let me go back to VN game save, history.to_array. So we can grab all the logs and save them just like that. Next thing we want is all of our active conversations. So active conversations equals, let's have a separate function gather all the information for us. So I'll make a private void called getConversationData. Not a void, actually, a string array for getConversationData, and active conversations will equal getConversationData. And then when we go to write it to file, we're just going to convert it into JSON format so we can write it to a disk. So string save JSON equals JSON utility.toJSON, and we're going to convert this whole class and all of its public and serializable variables to a JSON string, which we will then write to file. We don't have a way to write it to file just yet. We'll create that in a minute. For right now, let's go ahead and grab our conversation data. First things first, we need a list of strings that we're going to add all of our stuff to. So list string, and this will be our return data equal to a new list of strings. We're just going to convert our stuff into the conversation data containers and then convert them to JSON and add this to this list. So let's grab all of our conversations straight from our conversation manager. So conversations equals dialog system. We need dialog system.instance.conversation manager, and I don't think we have a way to get the stuff we need, so let's go to the conversation manager and create a way to get the conversations from our queue. So public, let's add a conversation. Should we make it an array? Should we? I think we will. Let's make it an array. Yeah. So conversation array get conversation queue. So this is going to reach into our conversation queue and grab all of our stuff from there, which we don't have it in our queue. So let's just head inside of our queue and make sure we can grab all of our conversations right from this field here. So down the bottom, I'll just make a public conversation array called get queue, and this will return conversation queue to array. So when we look at our conversation manager, if we're trying to get the queue, we'll call queue.getQueue, and might be a little confusing, that name, so I'll rename that to get read only. That way I can't access the queue directly. Conversation manager get the queue. So via game save, we'll get all of our conversations as conversation manager.get conversation queue. And now that we have all of our conversations, we can loop through all of them and convert them into the data types that we need. So let's go ahead and make a loop. For int I equals 0 while I cannot type, while I is less than our conversations.length, then I plus plus. So we got our basic loop. Let's grab our conversation as var conversation equals conversations I, and let's make a cache for the data. Since we can have either compressed data or full data, we'll just make a string for our JSON format and call it data equals nothing for right now. So let's take a look. If conversation.file, if we have a file, so if it's not equal to string.empty, we know that this came from an actual file, and we can compress it to use little space. Otherwise, we know that this did not come from a file, it came from somewhere else, and to be safe, we need to save the whole thing. So let's start with that. Let's go var full data equals new conversation data. That went all kinds of wrong. Conversation data. So we get the full data, and then full data dot conversation equals conversation dot get lines, and full data, wow, full data dot progress equals conversation dot get progress, and then we'll just say data equals JSON utility dot to JSON full data, and we've got what we can write to file. Whereas if we are using compressed data, then var compressed data. I'm sounding a little strange right now. So var compressed data is going to equal a new vn conversation data compressed. And we'll say compressed data.file name, so we can assign that to the file that's associated to our conversation. So now we know what file we need to load when we're reloading this. Let's also get compressed data progress equals conversation.get progress. We also want the start and end index. so that way we know what lines to rip when we go to pull this thing back from the file. So compressed data dot start index equals conversation dot file start index, and compressed data dot end index equals conversation end index, and data equals JSON utility dot to JSON compressed data. So after we have converted our data into whatever it's going to be, we'll go ahead and say return data is going to add this conversation, and it will be writable. So at the very end of that, all we're going to do is just go ahead and say return data dot to array. So we now have an array of all of our conversation data. So at this point, we can save our history logs and our conversations, save those to a JSON string, and then try to save that to file. So we'll save this to our file using our file manager. But we don't actually have a save function yet, so let's hop into file manager and make one. This is going to be static, just like the other ones. So public static void save. And we're just going to take a string for the file path for where we're going to save it, as well as a string for the JSON data. There are many different ways that you can save files in Unity. You can save them line by line, you can save multiple lines, you can save a list, what have you. You can save binary data. But since we're doing everything with JSON here, I'm just going to implement the save function that will take a single string, which will have all of our data inside of it. So that's all that we're going to do for this. So we're just going to take our file path and the JSON data and write that to file. So I'm actually going to steal from a script I wrote way back when. That is a file manager I've been using for a long time. And this is going to implement one function that we'll need for creating a directory if it doesn't already exist in whatever path we're providing. So if we provide a particular path and the directory for that file doesn't exist, we're just going to go ahead and automatically create it. So let's do a public static bool to see if it works or not. We'll call this try create directory from path, and we'll take in a string for the path that we're looking at. So string, actually no, I'm not gonna define that string. We'll just go ahead and look and see if directory.exists, and we'll look at the path. So if the directory exists, or our file.exists, if we've passed in a full file path, if either of those are true, then return true because it already exists. Now, if it doesn't, then let's take a look and see if this is a file or not. So if path.contains a dot, then it's probably a file. So we'll go ahead and say that we'll go ahead and say that path equals path.get directory name from path. And we'll also take a look and see if that path exists. So if directory.exists, the path, then we'll go ahead and return true because we don't need to do anything and it already exists. So if we make it this far, we know that this path does not exist. So let's go ahead and make sure it's valid. If path equals string.empty, then we'll go ahead and return false. It can't be created. If it doesn't, then let's go ahead and try to create it. So inside of a try block, let's say directory.create directory at this particular path. And if it works, we will return true. Now, if there's some kind of error, we'll identify it within a catch block, and we'll go ahead and say that debug.log error, and I'm going to say that something wrong happened. Could not create directory. And then we'll go ahead and say that it is going to be whatever sort of error that we had. So if we want to catch the error, then we need to make sure in our catch block, we go ahead and say system.exception as E. So E will be our error. And then we can go ahead and just pass in e.toString, and we'll be able to see what error there was and why we couldn't add this thing in. Actually, since I'm injecting that in the string, I don't actually have to define it as toString. It'll do it automatically. If it doesn't work, then we'll say return false, and nothing happens. So no matter what path we pass in, it's going to go ahead and try to create it for us, even if it's a runtime path, which is perfect. So let's go back to save here. Let's go ahead and check. If not try create directory from path at file path. If for some reason the directory does not exist and we couldn't create it, then we're going to go ahead and say debug.log error and let us know something bad happened and we could not save our file. So failed to save file. And I'm going to go ahead and put in my file path as file path. And please see the console for error details. And we'll go ahead and return and do nothing because we can't save if the directory doesn't exist. Now, if it does exist, let's go ahead and write the stuff to file. So stream writer is how we're going to write the file. SW equals new stream writer at the file path. So let's begin writing it. sw.write JSON data. And we're done. sw.close. That's easy. We have now written our JSON data to the file. And we've closed it. And now, if you want, we can go ahead and debug and log a message saying that we saved the file. So debug.log saved and saved data to file and pass in the file path. So file path right there. And we're done. So that's how we'll go ahead and save our information. So for our game save, when we save, we're going to say FileManager.save and pass in our save JSON. Well, actually, first thing we need to do is we need to save the file path. So file path, and then specify our save JSON data. So we'll go ahead and save it to our file, and that will be good to go. If we want to test this out and make sure things are working right now, let's make a new testing script. So inside of scripts in the testing folder, I'm going to make a new script called vngamesave testing. And you know what? I've already got one attached to my testing object, so I guess I already created one. Let's hop in that, and it's just completely blank. So yeah, I guess I did. I just forgot I made it already. So let's go ahead and do something here. Inside of update, I'm going to give myself a choice. So if input.getKeyDown, keycode.s for save, then I'm going to save the file. Else if input.getKeyDown, keycode.l for load, then we're going to load. So if I save, I'm going to say vngamesave dot vngamesave, make sure we're using the visual novel namespace, dot active file dot save. Otherwise, vngamesave dot active file dot load. That'll work as long as we have an active file that is assigned. So at the very beginning, let's go ahead and say vngamesave dot active file equals new vngamesave, and it's automatically going to default to slot number 1, so we'll have a decent file name. So with that in place, we should be able to save our file. We just won't be able to load it just yet because we haven't implemented that logic, but at least we can see it being written to file. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that's active in the scene, and we'll go ahead and start our first line, and I will save. All right, so we can see in the console, save data to assets, app data, save files, 1.vns. So it should be there. If I look at project, and if I look in assets, we don't have app data yet, so we just need to refresh. So we refresh, there's app data right there, save files, and now we have a file called 1.vns. So if I choose to open this thing, I've got it where it will automatically open with Atom, but let's say that you don't. If I go ahead and show in Explorer, you can right-click this file and choose to open with and choose some program to open this up with. You can open anything with Notepad, so if you don't have a particular application for this, just use Notepad and you can open up your file inside of Notepad just like this, and we can see the stuff that is in this file. So you can see the JSON format. It has saved everything that it needs. So player name is actually nothing, that hasn't been defined. Slot number is 1, that's correct. And here we are. This is what we're looking for, our active conversations. So here's our active state, which is our history information. And we've even got our logs somewhere. The logs would be somewhere here. I don't see, oh, there they are. So history logs are right here. It's just empty because we didn't have anything. But now we can see our active conversations right here in this line. So we only have one entry, which has a file name of dialog files, chapter 1, and then a start index of 0, an end index of 60, so it's reading the whole file, and progress of 2. So let's look at that real quick. So here we are. If I've got this open, we can see start index is 0, which, yep, of course, 0 is going to be the beginning of the file, and our progress is 2. So if we look at line 1 is actually index 0, we have 0, 1, and then 2, which is exactly the line that we were working on. Now, one thing I see is end index is listed as 60, so that's interesting because 60 is, wait a second, I think my numbering is, oh yeah, that's fine, because we just subtract 1 from it all. Yep, so 60 is actually 61, and that does indicate the very end of the file here. And we can even see our history state that's been written to file. Active state with the current dialogue on screen, as well as the current speaker, the dialogue font that's used, and the color of the font, and all that other stuff. As well as the audio. So audio has channel 0 as with a track name called Rainy Mood, which is running the track at audio ambience Rainy Mood. It's got everything here, so it's actually saving this pretty well. So that's good. Let's go back to the game save script, and now let's go ahead and load it. So if I save this to a file, I should be able to load it from the file and reapply it on screen as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. If we call load here, then let's check our active state. If active state is not equal to null, then let's reapply it on screen. Active state.load, and that will load our history state back on the screen. And history manager dot instance dot history equals history logs. We'll go ahead and repopulate our list. Let's see, can't implicitly, oh yeah, so since we saved it as an array, we can't really send that back to the history logs as it is, because the history logs is actually a list, so we need to convert this to a list first. And the simplest way to do that is, since this is an array, we can just say dot to list. There, and we apply all the logs that were saved in file right back to our history manager. As for our active conversations, that one's a little more tricky. So we need to go through, and instead of getting the conversation data, let's go ahead and set the conversation data. So private void set conversation data. And that will be the last thing I call in load. So set conversation data and reapply it to the screen and the conversation manager. So let's go ahead and make all of our conversations get added back to the conversation queue. So for int I equals 0, let's start at the very beginning, and while I is less than active conversations.length I++. Let's go through every single one of these things. They're saved in JSON format, so we need to reconvert them. So string data equals our active conversations at index I. And when we convert it back to a conversation, let's just go ahead and catch it here. Conversation equals null. Okay, so let's try to see if it is full data or not. So var full data equals JSON utility dot from JSON, and we're going to try to convert this to VN conversation data and take in the JSON data string. So let's see, if full data is not equal to null. Wow, what in the world is up with my keyboard? Oh, for some reason why is this highlighted? I tell you what, I have fat-fingered so many things. I don't know what that was all about. But if full data is not equal to null, then let's go ahead and load the new conversation. So conversation equals new conversation, and we're going to just grab all of our lines back from this full data JSON string. So we've already gotten it back in the original data type, so we can just say full data.conversation, which has all of the lines. And let's restore the progress. So full data.progress. And there we go. We've got our conversation restored. We don't need to reference a file or the indices there because they don't matter for this full data context here. But if that's not true, then let's try to get it as the compressed data. So let's go ahead and say that var compressed data equals JSON utility dot from JSON the vn conversation data compressed, taking in our data. So if compressed data is not equal to null, then let's go ahead and grab our data back where it should have been. If we're loading the compressed data, then we just want to go ahead and grab the text asset from the file name that was saved here. So text asset file equals resources.load. And let's go ahead and grab the text asset from the compressed data.file name. So that'll give us the original file where this conversation was pulled from. And let's get all the lines. So list string lines equals file manager.read text asset. And let's read the file. We will include the blank lines, so we'll leave that as is. And we can go ahead and say conversation equals new conversation and pass in the lines as well as the compressed data.progress for where we stopped at, the compressed data.file name, and pass in the original indices too. So the start index and the compressed data.end index. Which reminds me, we actually need to grab the lines that are the only lines that really matter for this conversation. So if this was a sub-conversation, we only want to grab the lines that fall within the start and end index. So we need to rip the lines out of this list here. This list originally contains all the lines of the file, but we just want to isolate the ones that we need for this particular conversation in the queue. Now, when you're messing with runtime data, it's best to include as much error detection as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take every single one of these things and I'm going to encapsulate all of it inside of a try block. And catch I'll say system.exception as E, and just say debug.log exception, or log, so I'll do log error, and say encountered error while extracting saved conversation data. And I'll go ahead and just go ahead and paste in E. And continue. So continue on to the next one. So as we try to do all of this, I'm going to go ahead right at this point and now take all these lines that we have and only extract the ones that we need based off of our start and end index. We'll start by defining the count of how many lines that we want. So I will make an integer called count, and that will be equal to our compressed data dot end index minus our compressed data dot start index. This is how many lines that we want. So if our start index is 0, it's at the beginning of the file, and the end index is at the end, then we're taking all the lines. But if we've only got if we've got a different number, then we'll figure out exactly how many that we want. So lines equals file manager dot read text asset, and we're going to skip using link. We're going to skip from compressed data dot start index. We'll go ahead and skip up to that one, and then we're going to take as many as we have identified in our count. and then convert this to a list. So we are snagging only the ones that apply to this conversation. Okay, now if the compressed data is null, then this either the file's been corrupted or something bad happened, and we're going to let us know that this format is unknown. So debug.log, and this is going to say unknown conversation format. Unable to reload conversation from VN game save using data, and I'll pass in the data right there. All right. So we'll know if something weird happens there. Now, if that's not the case, if we have gone ahead and we've converted and we've got our conversation generated, then we need to add it to our conversation manager. So let's go through every conversation that we've just added, and let's start a new conversation with the first element and enqueue all of the rest of them. So let's look at if conversation is not equal to null, and our conversation dot get lines dot count is greater than 0, then let's go ahead and do something. If I equals 0, if this is the first one in the list, then this was the priority conversation. So we need to make sure that we cause our conversation manager to start a brand new conversation with this one at the top, and then we'll just enqueue all of the preceding ones after it. So dialog system.instance.conversation manager.start conversation, and we'll pass in the conversation. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say dialog system.instance.conversation manager.enqueue, and we will enqueue the conversation. So in our game save testing script, we have the ability to save our VN game save, but we also need to be able to load it. And that means we need to reach back into the file and go ahead and load this thing back from memory. So we're going to use our file manager for that, but we'll go ahead and say that VN game save dot active file is going to equal something else. It's going to equal file manager dot load, and we don't have a load function. So let's go to our file manager and let's create a load function. So this is going to be a public static generic type T load, where we will return a generic type. So that way we can go ahead and convert whatever JSON data is in our file to whatever type of file format that we want to, or whatever type of class we want to load it back into. We're going to take in a string for our file path, and that we're also going to take in whether we want to include the blank lines or not, which by default will be true, but we'll just add the capability here. So remove blank lines. And you know what? It's really such a default. I don't think I'm going to add it in here. We'll just take in the file path. So let's check and see if this file exists. First of all, if file.exists file path, then we can go ahead and try to return this thing. If it does not exist, then we'll just return a message. So we'll go ahead and say debug.log error, and this will be error file does not exist, and I'll pass in the file name, which will be represented as file path, and return default T. If the file does exist, let's go ahead and grab the JSON data from it. So string JSON data equals file.read all lines, or read all lines. I think you could use read all text there, but we'll just reference the only line that's going to be in this file as 0. And then we'll return JSON utility dot from JSON. We'll convert it to T, and we will convert our JSON data to T. So now we can load this back. So we'll go ahead and say load it as a v-in-game save, and what are we loading? We're loading something at a particular path, which is going to be, basically we're going to take file paths dot game saves, and the only file I'm working with right now is just one. So I'm just going to say that this is one. And I'm also going to pass in the v-in-game save dot file type. So if we try to load, we're going to grab it and read it from the file, and then we're going to load it. This should allow us to load it from memory, and if all works well, we should see everything get applied back on screen, and we should be able to pick up where we left off. Only way to know is to try it out. So here we are. We are going to proceed through our dialog file. Alright, and I will go ahead and go to the in, and I'm gonna go ahead and get us to this next scene. Alright, so now I'm going to save. Save data to save files 1 VNS. So I'll close that out. Let me go ahead and look at file 1 and see what that looks like. Okay, so we can see that it's much bigger. It's got a lot more information in here because we got all them history states and everything. So it has saved a bunch of information. And we see this thing is 48.2 kilobytes. So that's pretty small. Very small, very manageable. If you don't want to save your history logs, you can shave that file size down quite considerably. But let's go ahead. So I'm going to start a brand new file here. We have now started at the very beginning, so now I'm going to hit L. Okay, and L loaded the file. It put the characters back on screen, took me back where I needed to go. Here's the test. Let's try to continue where I left off. Let's just hope they have a room here. Let's find out. Looks good. Hello, is anyone there? Stepping out from the room, tall with man. Okay, here comes the innkeeper. And looks like we can go through everything. Ah, but you know what didn't apply? The history logs. Oh, yeah. So I actually need to go back and generate a log because the history states got reapplied to the history manager, but the logs didn't get recreated. So that's one thing I got to do. So it turns out my little clear function that we made for the log manager is going to come in handy. Inside of our v-in-game save, when we load, after we apply the history, let's go ahead and say history manager.instance.logmanager.clear. So let's clear all of the logs, and then we need to rebuild them. So history manager.instance.logmanager.rebuild. That method does not exist, but let's go ahead and control dot and generate the method. So here we are. I'll make this publicly accessible, public void rebuild, and basically all we're going to do is we're going to go through every single log inside of the history manager, and we are going to add a log. So we're going to use this create log function, but we're going to do it for every single one of the history states. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So I'll just do it for each. For each var, for each with an H, for each var state in history. Didn't I have a variable for history? No, I guess I didn't. So history manager.instance history. I could have swore I had one. Did I not? No. Oh, yeah, logs. Wait, no. No, logs is... Yeah, okay, so I'll just access manager.history. So for each var state in manager.history, then we're going to create log state. So we're basically going to rebuild our entire history log for our system. So we look back at v-in-game save, we go ahead and reapply the entire history, and we clear out the list and rebuild the list. And as I reload, if I bring up my logs, there they all are. I've got all my logs back. Okay, cool. And we proceed further, and okay, finally out of that storm, it's continuing exactly the way it should. Perfect, so let's go and make sure that it's loading all the conversations correctly, because right now we're only operating off of one conversation. And so I've gone ahead and made a new chapter file, which goes ahead and gives us some different opportunities to generate more conversations. So we get the input here, we try to get our name, and if we say Spider-Man, then narrator is going to say we are the Amazing Spider-Man, and so on we do some different things depending on what we input. So these would be two different conversations right here. And then once we get into choices, this would be a new conversation, and this would be a new one, and then these would be new conversations inside of this one. So we'll have multi-layered testing here. All in all, I should be able to save anywhere and continue off from it and skip past the lines that I'm not supposed to see. That's the whole idea of this. So let's go ahead and try this one. I'll go ahead and make sure in my testing script that the complex chapter is set as the file to read in my test dialog files. And let's go ahead and try. Okay, so we come to our dialog file. I'm going to go ahead and save this right now and come back in and reload. Okay, then, okay, so I noticed that I need to also change the prompt position. Well, let's go ahead and proceed forward. Okay, yeah, so it's going through all right. Save system. Okay, so now we ask for the name. I'm going to go ahead and say Spider-Man and accept. So you are the amazing Spider-Man. And that is an impressive thing. I'm going to go ahead and save here and then exit out. And as I look at that file, I can see that there's a problem right away. So the top conversation, which is the newly generated one, should have 3 lines. I can see that the start index and the end index are actually the same as the parent conversation, even though the progress is different, which identifies it as a different conversation. We can see that line 21 is the second conversation, which is actually the very first one that was running, so index 21 is actually right here. So that is the if statement setting the first conversation to the point where it terminates, so that way it can continue off at the next line. So that's right. But what's not right is this top one, which is the if conversation. See, I answered Spider-Man here, and it took me in here, and I stopped off saving right here, which is index 1, and we can see progress is set to 1, so it's got the right progress. But the start index should be 13, and the end index should be 15 here. Whereas I am getting the same start and end as the original conversation, so that's not working right. Need to make sure that that updates appropriately. And this is coming from my LL condition script where I go and create the new conversation. Instead of referencing the selected data, I'm referencing the current conversation when I get the file start index. So that needs to be selected data dot starting index and selected data dot ending index. I need to be careful about that, but that should get us the right numbers. So let's try this again. I go back to the second line and save. And now I can see that the start index is 10 and the end index is 20. That still doesn't look right. And the reason it's doing that is index 10 is actually this line right here, and index 20 is right here. So it's capturing the entire data, the entire encapsulated data for this whole if statement here. What I want is I want to capture the data right in here for each of these two, for the if data and the else data, whichever one I've selected. So I can see why this is happening. If I do the debug log here, if I look at if data, then if data has a starting index of 10 and an ending index of 20, while else data has a starting index of 16 and an ending index of 20. That means the if data is starting at 10, moving all the way to 20, so it's starting at the if segment, while else is starting at 16 at the else segment and ending at 20. The reason if is ending at the end of else is because if I find else, I'm setting the if ending index to the else index, and that's because when we set the current conversation's progress after the whole if else statement is read, we're setting it to the end of everything. So it's automatically going to set our current conversation to bypass if and else while we generate the new priority conversation using the if else data. You know, I hope that came across clear. The reason we were setting the if data ending index to be the else data ending index, so that way the whole encapsulator would show our current conversation where the endpoint for everything is. So in order, since we're using this for a save system now, we need to run it slightly differently. So set progress is, I'm gonna do something a little different. I'm gonna do a check, and I'm just going to see if my else data, if my else data dot is null. If that's true, we'll go with if data ending index. Otherwise, we'll go with else data dot ending index. That way I can keep them both where they need to be. They can both identify only their ending points. And with that change, if I run it again, I can see that if data is now identifying the start as 10 and the end as 15, while else data is identifying the start as 16 and the end as 20. So if I could look back at current conversation and see the progress is set to 20, even though I chose if data. So it is working. And that means now if is identifying 10 through 15, which is the whole if segment, and else is identifying 16 through 20. Now, if I were to run this debugger on a choice, then I can see selected choice when I choose yes as my response in my dialog file. I can see the start index is 25 and the end index is 38. So I just need to make sure that this matches up. In my dialog file, I can see that yes, the start is index 25 and the end is index 38. So that's getting the entire content for the choices. So that's perfect. But the condition, it's also identifying the header and the encapsulators. So I just need to make sure that I change up the start and end index when I pass those into the conversation that's being generated. Because I don't want it to include the header. I just want it to include these lines and the line numbers when we create the new conversation. So I will go ahead and do it this way. Since I know that they're both written the same way, and we have 2 lines at the beginning and 1 line at the very end, I'll just come down after I get my selected data, and I'll go ahead and make a little comment here saying remove the header and encapsulator lines from the conversation indexes. So cell data dot starting index plus equals 2, so I can bypass the if or else line as well as the starting encapsulator, and cell data dot ending index minus equals 1. This is basically what we were doing with the choices when we were creating the starting and end choicing as we were ripping the choices from the encapsulated data. We just didn't do anything else to our encapsulated data here, so we need to go through and make sure that we collect only what we need here. And running through this one more time, if I go back into my cell data, I can see that it has changed from the starting index of 10 and the ending index of 15 to 12 and 14 respectively. What that means is I'm now getting index 12 through 14. I am getting only the lines inside of the condition. That's exactly what we want. So we're back here. I'm going to go ahead and type in Spider-Man again, except, and there we go. So I will hit save. I have to save the file, so let's look at it. As I go back in, I can see that the original conversation has the full length with progress 21, skipping right past the if-else segment, while the priority conversation, which is the true if condition, now has the start index of 12, the start index of 14, and the progress 1 indicating it is on the second line out of that range. Now it looks like it should be working, but when I try to load, we don't do anything at all. We just keep continuing with the default conversation. And this is actually because of a JSON utility conversion issue here. So you can see that when we have only been saving compressed data because we've had file references, but they're still popping up as full data because the VN conversation data and the VN conversation data compressed are so close to each other, they're actually identified as the same thing. So in addition to checking if it's null or not, I'm also going to add another check to see if full data dot conversation is not equal to null, and full data dot conversation dot count is greater than 0, just to make sure that if it did load this as a full conversation, it did grab the right data. If it didn't grab it, then it's probably not the conversation data, it's probably compressed data. So if compressed data is not equal to null and compressed data dot file name, since these are the two unique things between them, that's what we're going to be checking, is not equal to string dot empty. Then if we run this, we should get our conversations being added appropriately. Because it was treating it as full data instead of compressed data, it was actually creating an empty conversation, and because the count was 0, it was not even adding it to our conversation queue. So now let's try this again. Let's go ahead and load it. All right, so I'm going to hit L. There we are. That's an impressive thing. Okay, it actually did position my prompt right. Let's go ahead and click. We should get one more line, but we did not. Instead, we do go to our choice, so it looks like the progress is being set, right? So I'm going to say, I don't know if it's working. So we're testing things. Go ahead, save. And if it works from you, okay, let's try some of our variables. And it actually was supposed to have another line after that as well. So you can see that when we reloaded, we did start back here, but we didn't load this line. And once we made it back to the original conversation, we read this, but we didn't read that one. So it's kind of like we're skipping the last line whenever we're ripping the lines from the compressed data. So we might be skipping one too many. And that's exactly what we're doing, actually. So in our v-in-game save, we want to go to set conversation data, and once we get our list of lines, where we read the text asset and skip up to the start index, we take as many items as we are supposed to have in this range, but this does not include the final item. We need to add 1 there to include the last index, and that will get us our final line. So without changing anything else, without saving another file, let's go back in. I'm going to hit L. And now I've gone back to that's an impressive thing. So we should go to which line? We should go to this line. I got bit by a spider once and just got a medical bill. So let's click. There we are. It's going ahead and it's reading it right. And now we continue and looks like it is working. So amazing. Give yourself a pat on the back. Did you give yourself a pat on the back? Not at all. Okay. I'm actually going to save here again. So now I'm going to save here in the middle of like 3 tiers of conversations. And here we are. So now we've gone to the end of the file. We're now back at the original conversation that we've just loaded from file. Which means if all is working well, we should go past this line and read the final line of our dialog file. So let's do it. We go past, there we are, first line, 1 more, and there we go. Okay, so it looks like we are loading it right. So I just saved like an encapsulation depth of 3. So we should have 3 different conversations that are saved in memory here. And if we look in our file, I can see, yes, we have 3 different conversations saved, all with their correct indexes. And we should be able to load this back right. So fingers crossed, let's go ahead and hit the load button. Okay, so yeah, we can see that we pick right back up. But I'm not, so you got to do it for me. Now we still need to save some variables, so let's continue. Let's try some of our variables. It's important to save the variable store. Okay, yeah, that's actually working great. So what happened there is we just loaded back into the 3rd stack conversation and proceeded back to the original, all of which was being loaded from file and ripped directly from the source dialog file. And it went ahead, pulled everything, skipped the lines it didn't need to run, so that's pretty good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple other lines here. So narrator, I'm going to say this is back to the 2nd conversation. Okay. Yep, let's be done with it now and go back to the original. So when we finish the 3rd one, or when we finish, I'm going to save in the middle of I sure did here. And then we should go ahead and finish up this, and then finish these lines, and then go to the end here. So I'm going to rerun it, and I'm going to save right in the middle of I sure did here. Okay, I've just made it to give yourself a pat on the back, so I'm now in the third conversation. Actually, no, I wasn't. I needed to go one step further. Okay, let's just go ahead and roll through the whole thing. What's your name? Okay, nice to meet you. All right. So here we are, second conversation. Is it working? Yes. Amazing. Give yourself a pat on the back. Here we are, third conversation. I sure did. Okay, good, you've earned it. Now I'm going to save. Console says I've gone ahead and saved file, and let's go ahead and quit. And now let's relaunch it and hit the L key once it comes back up. L, there we are. Good, you've earned it. Okay. So what should happen is we should go through, there's a lot more to cover, and we still need to save variables. So we click, there's a lot more to cover, and we still need to save variables. And now that's the end of conversation 3, so we should go back to conversation 2. And continuing conversation 2, narrator should speak and tell us it's the second conversation, and Stella should take us back to the original, and then we continue with the final lines. So let's see. Actually, we didn't. That's interesting. Now, the reason this is happening is if we look back at the second conversation, the progress is being set to 39 for some reason. Which means when it goes back to the second conversation to finish it up, it sees that it's way past the endpoint, and it's going to skip and go back to the third one. So my question is, why is this second one identifying its progress as 39 when it never finished? So after just a little bit of digging, I see that the issue is when we are executing our choice. When we execute the choice and we go and start the new conversation of what we've just selected, then we go ahead and set the previous conversation to the ending index of the encapsulated data we've just ripped. The problem with this is that is good for the first conversation and the first conversation only. The first conversation operates off of the indexes from 0, which is the beginning of the file, to whatever the end is. But any conversation that comes after that is operating on the index of its list only, because it may be a part of that file, but we're no longer looking at the indexes of the file, we're looking at the indexes of the list. And ending index here is not the ending index of the list, it's the ending index of the file, which means we need to take into account the file index and the list index here and make sure that we're setting it appropriately for our choices. And fortunately for us, we've already got this. So you can see when we encapsulate the data and we rip the encapsulation data, we're already taking into account the file start index, so that way we can just increment from that. Well, that's basically what we want to do here. So we want to take our ending index, which is the ending index of the file, and subtract our current conversation dot file start index. That way we get the relative index of the spot in the list or the conversation where this thing actually needs to terminate at. So not the line in the file, but the line in the list. As we do that, let's go ahead back in here again, and let's try our saving again. So I'm going to go right back to the very end, and we're going to go ahead and go, is it working? Yes. I'll go ahead and go to the third conversation. Sure did. Okay, and now we'll save. So we've saved that. I'll close it, and now I will relaunch, and we'll load again, and we should be able to go through everything perfectly. Okay, so we reload. Good, you've earned it. There's a lot more to cover, so we should keep going. And we can see, yep, that is the line that comes after it, so we should have one more line, and then we should go to the narrator talking that they're at the second conversation. So let's continue. We got that one more line, and now the next line should be the narrator because we're returning to the second conversation. There it is. This is back to the second conversation. And yep, let's be done with it now and go back to the original. So now we have ended the second conversation, and we should go back to the original one where we finish off the dialog file. So let's try it. Let's try some of our variables, okay? It's important to save the variable store to file as well. That's it. So that is going ahead and saving our progress in the file. No matter how many conversations we have running, no matter what kind of conditions we've had rolling, this is going ahead and it's saving our progress in every single one of those cases, and we're able to roll through our dialog file. Looks like seamlessly. One thing I'll add to loading is I've noticed that when we load the state, that while the text is rebuilding, we still have the prompt visible in the wrong spot. So after we set the conversation data, I'm also going to say dialog system.instance.prompt.hide. That way it's hidden while the text is being brought on screen. And let's go ahead and see. Load. There we go. And the prompt only comes up when it's done. Okay. That is it for this one. I'm going to leave this off there, and we're going to go ahead and take care of our variables in the next part. So that one should be a little more simple than the video that we did today. There was a lot of back and forth and a lot of things that we needed to change in order to add this save system into our visual novel. But now that it's in, that gives us quite a good tool in our pocket. So we'll continue this in the next episode, and we'll get our variables saved as well.